Well, I want to welcome you all to this panel discussion, Cuba's Competing Processes, Succession versus Transition. Will Cuba be the first communist regime extinguished in the first generation? This is a conversation with Professors Jaime Suchlicki and Carlos Eire. Your moderator, John Suarez. Waiting a couple moments, a number of people are entering. And we'll get underway momentarily. It's going to be beginning with Professor Carlos Eire, who's going to give a 10-minute presentation, followed by Dr. Suchlicki. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers. Our first speaker is a Yale University scholar, writes often about Cuban politics and culture. His memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana, received the National Book Award for nonfiction. He's the author of several other books, including A Very Brief History of Eternity and Reformations, the Early Modern World. Without further ado, Professor Carlos Eire. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for organizing this. And to add to your introduction, I think almost everyone knows, but in case someone doesn't know, I haven't been trained as a Cuba expert. My field is late medieval and early modern European religious history. So I tried to get as far from Cuba as I could in my professional training because I knew what obstacles I would face if I was working on Cuba. But you know, what I'd like to say is based partly on my knowledge of history and partly on what I've been able to follow online about what is happening at the highest echelons of Cuban oligarchy. Yeah, see, I knew at some point a dog would bark. That happens at every Zoom meeting, or a cat. Anyway, the main issue with this current transition is, of course, that it's totally opaque, and it is nearly impossible to get any sense of what might really be going on behind the scenes. And as I learned after having a conversation with former AP stringer in Havana, those journalists who work for the major news organizations really are hamstrung, and they can be very easily kicked off the island for simply reporting the truth. What we get from Cuban social media, of course, there's a lot of information on what is happening to the dissidents and what is happening to the Cuban population as a whole. But it's also secret, so hush-hush about what's going on behind the scenes among those who are really in control. But what I know from history is that, you know, these very secretive oligarchies, such as the one we have in Cuba, which is a military junta, is that they do try to keep what's going on a secret. And there can always be a surprise, and you don't know when there's a palace coup. You don't know when one is brewing, and often you don't find out a palace coup has taken place until it happens. So we're in the dark. But what I've been able to pick up, and it's not proven, it's more in the gossip category than news category. And this came out when Raul stepped down, was that Raul's son and the minister who runs Gaesa, basically the entire tourist industry, Callejas, are jockeying for the top spot. And that Miguel Diaz-Canel is still pretty much, well, some kind of puppet who is good at public events, good to show himself up, but it doesn't really have that much power. Whether that is true or not, I don't know. And I don't know what Jaime has to say about this. But the fact is that the two top men who are related to each other, because Callejas is Raul's former son-in-law, married one of Raul's daughters. So it's still pretty much all in the Castro family, if not by blood relation, at least by through marriage, although he and Raul's daughter divorced. There was a report that Alejandro, Raul's son, had an altercation with Callejas in which he actually punched him and knocked him out. But we all know, all those of us who are used to the way that Cuban news from the underground are spread. There's Radio Bemba, Radio Lip. You get gossip instead of news. But if we think back to the Soviet Union and how difficult it was for even the most expert Sovietologists to accurately predict what was going on during any transition of power, or when you had surprising transitions of power, they were really surprised sometimes, the top experts. I think this is what we have to take into consideration for what's happening in Cuba now. In the past, all such oligarchies in which power is divided, because let's face it, without a Castro on the throne, without a single figure, Fidel and then Raul, now the power is splintered among these military men. And the question is, who's going to emerge on top? Because from my experience, the way politics has worked in all of human history, it's very difficult for any government to be run with a splintered oligarchy. Power is consolidated usually. So my question is, and actually I have more of a question than a report. My question is, what can any outside agency, whether it be a country or dissident groups abroad, what can anyone do to ensure that when the slightest crack appears, something can be done to inject outside influence on these very secretive inside processes? Can the U.S. do anything? How likely is it that President Biden or anyone in his administration would want to intervene or do anything once they see that there's a power struggle going on? We're, as I think 2 meetings ago at the Center for Free Cuba, where we all heard this and talked about it, that in fact this is a very unique time, and we may have an opportunity now that the transition is in place. Perhaps we have more of a chance, those of us who are outsiders who can in any way influence events on the island, might be able to, for lack of a better term, horn in. But I find it almost impossible to think, if not actually impossible to think, that the European Union is going to do anything, because they're in bed. They have been in bed with the Castro regime for so long. And the Spanish have so much invested in the Cuban tourist industry that I think it's highly unlikely the EU would do anything. So who else could do anything would be the United States. And with the current administration, that makes the question mark even larger and bolder. What is likely to happen with Joseph Biden at the helm, is he going to resurrect the Obama policy? I don't know if you saw the statement released by him and the Secretary of State a few days ago, which was perfect sort of Washington-ese, what can I call it? Psychobabble of sorts. Vague, empty promises about helping the Cuban people, vague, empty promises about the Cuban people determining their own future, and also mentioned specifically that the U.S. would love to support the cuentapropistas, the self-employed. I don't know how anyone else would interpret it, but I interpreted this as some kind of warning, advance warning, that perhaps the Obama policy is going to be resurrected whenever it's politically safe for the Biden administration to do this. I thought the statement was, for all of its vagueness, was very transparent. That's my greatest fear as somebody who would like to see the current regime collapse, is that even though it might be actually eating itself from the inside with infighting, the US might actually step in and go back to supporting the regime in all the ways that the Obama deal supported the regime. And once the COVID plague is over and the tourist industry kicks up again, how likely is it that that would be the moment when the Biden administration reopens the gates, floodgates, for tourists to go back to Cuba, or reopens, or actually makes a larger opening in the remittances, which bring billions of dollars to the regime annually. And not being a Washington insider, not even being a Washington outsider. I mean, I'm stuck in the 16th and 17th century. But is there anything that an organization such as the Center for Free Cuba and other organizations, dissidents on the island, might be able to do to exert some pressure? And the Cuban expression palanca is to have leverage. Is there any possibility of having any leverage once the cracks start showing, or even before the cracks begin to show? If there is a power grab, either by Alejandro Castro or Lopez, I don't know who would be worse. Well, Alejandro is younger, I think. So that might be a sign that, well, there could be continuity and this could go on indefinitely. So as you can see, I have more questions than information about what is going on. I'd like almost everyone else pretty much in the dark. I think the dissidents, we're at a special time now, because just as the dissidents were starting to get international attention with the San Isidro movement and all these other arrests that have been taking place recently.
Please.
What they are clamping down even more aggressively on dissidents now than they had in the previous few months. So basically I have a coin with two faces, right? One is partly optimistic. There's an opportunity that maybe something could be done at this juncture. But the other is pessimistic, that perhaps when all the infighting is completed and somebody rises to the top, they might end up being just as bad as what was there before, or perhaps even worse. And during a Biden administration, it's highly likely that whatever happens, if anyone strengthens their power base in Havana, Biden administration will back them up. I just saw an article from a Minnesota newspaper, very typical Midwestern plea for lifting the so-called embargo because Minnesotan farmers could cash in so deeply the Cuban market. Once again, I don't know how they managed to do this, but they've convinced just about every Midwestern farmer that there's gold to be found in lifting the embargo, which would mean, of course, allowing Cuba to pay on credit rather than cash, which would mean that all of us who live here in the US and pay taxes would end up paying for whatever it is that Minnesota farmers sell to the Castro regime. That's basically what I have to say. From my very odd perspective, I once was asked by the New York Times to write an op-ed, but they told me what they wanted me to write. It was when Fidel Castro fell ill and Cubans were celebrating in the streets in Miami. So they point blank asked me to write an op-ed in which I would criticize Cubans for delighting in the failing health of Fidel Castro, who had been so good to them. They told me he's done so much for the Cuban people, and he allowed all the exiles to leave. He allowed them to leave. So I said, yeah, I'll write an essay for you. And they kept asking, well, what will you say? What will you say? They asked me that about 5 times. What will you say? So I thought I would go academic on them. And I said, here's what I'll say. I'll say that Niccolo Machiavelli had no student better than Fidel Castro, who just mastered the art of Machiavellian politics and knew how to be feared and loved at the same time. And New York Times said, no, that's not right. That's not right. But in fact, I often think I'm back in the 16th century, especially in Italy, all those city-states with their oligarchies when I'm dealing with the current regime in Cuba.
Thank you very much, Professor Eire. We'll now pass over to Professor Jaime Suchlicki, the director of the Cuban Studies Institute. He's written many articles and several books, including Cuba from Columbus to Castro and Beyond. Dr. Suchlicki is often interviewed by TV, radio, and print media on Cuba and Latin American politics. One of his latest reports is Doing Business in Cuba, Investors Beware. Thank you, Dr. Suchlicki.
Well, if I can quiet my dog, I can probably speak more intelligently. Most of the questions that I've been asked since the meeting of the Communist Party of the Politburo and Raúl's resignation is, this is going to fall apart. Raúl is gone. The military will fight among themselves. There's going to be problems in the Politburo, and this thing won't hold. My answer has been that this is one way to analyze and to look at Cuba. Who are the leaders? If they leave, will there be a revolt? Will there be a new leader? In 2006, when Fidel became ill and stepped down, Miami was abuzz in the idea that, well, this is the end of the revolution. This is going to fall apart, and it's not going to continue. At that point, I kept on telling people that there are strengths in Cuba beyond the leadership. And the strength is based on the role of the military, the role of the security apparatus, and the role of the Communist Party, and particularly the Politburo of the Communist Party. And I said that that would be a more productive way of understanding what's happening in Cuba, and what was happening will happen in the future, looking at the strength of the, I'm sorry, at the strength of the institutions rather than the leadership. Raul Castro was very careful in leaving in the Politburo 3 key elements of the control of the Cuban population. One is General Alvaro Lopez Miera. Lopez Miera is one of these historic generals that went to the mountains with Raul and with Fidel when he was 16 years and has remained with the revolution for the past 61, 62 years. So he is a trusted subordinate of Raul, and Raul is almost his godfather. So he is now Minister of the Armed Forces and a member of the Politburo, which he wasn't before Raul left. The second one that wasn't in the Politburo and it was now placed in the Politburo is Luis Rodriguez Lopez Calleja. He is Raul Castro's former son-in-law, married to one of Raul's daughters. He is the banker of the Cuban Revolution. He runs most of the enterprise, the airlines, the ship, the businesses, the investments, the trade. So he is a key figure from the point of view of his control of money. And the other one that was put in the Politburo, which wasn't there yesterday, and very few people know him, is Lázaro Alves Casa. Lázaro Alvarez Casa is the Minister of the Interior, which is to say the KGB, the Stasi, a combination of those that runs both the internal and external affairs of security in Cuba. So if you look at the other members of the Politburo, Diaz-Canel, who is the president of Cuba and is now the Secretary General of the party, has no popular support in Cuba, number one. Number two, no support in the party. And number three, it's not a charismatic figure that could emerge and become a leader in the future. He was placed in there because he's younger, because Raul wanted him, and Raul trusted him, and he is an apparatchik of the party that will do what Raul tells him to do. So if you analyze the members of the Politburo, all of the other ones are irrelevant, not important, have no basis of support, and they're not going to be able to emerge to lead Cuba. So it's a combination now, as we look at the future, of the military with Lopez Miera, the security apparatus with Alvarez Casas, and the purse of the regime with Rodriguez Lopez Calleja. So that is the shape of Cuba, in addition to a military who seems to be loyal. We haven't interviewed any lieutenants, any captains, any colonels, so we don't know how they think. On the one hand, they may think that they would like to end this regime and create a new one. On the other hand, we may think that they want to replace the upper military and take over and become involved in the graft and corruption and the drug business of the military in Cuba. So it's not clear where the younger elements within the military stand, but it's for real that the control, sectoral control that the military and the security apparatus has throughout the island is heavy, hasn't been broken. There is no evidence that it's falling apart. The evidence is that there's more unhappiness on the part of the Cuban people, in part because of the problem with food, in part because of the problem with coronavirus, in part because it's been 61, 62 years. It's been a long time. So there is that kind of malaise in society, but it's not organized. The methods of control are good. The military and the security is listening to conversation, is listening to the limited internet that exists in Cuba. So therefore, there isn't that kind of a deterioration that we saw in Poland or in the Soviet Union or in other parts of Eastern Europe preceding the end of communism. I think that I may be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, but I think that this regime has a few years more to go. And American foreign policy, and this is one thing that my colleague was touching on, can help the regime if they want to release tourism to Cuba, if they want to allow Cuba to send money. It would help economically, but there is very little they can do to undermine the regime and to weaken the regime any further. So whether they try to be helpful or whether they try to be tough with the Cuban regime, it's a very difficult picture. Even, and I've discussed this at length with a number of people, even if Venezuela were to collapse tomorrow, this is not going to be the end of the Castro era. Venezuela is sending Cuba less than 60,000 barrels of petroleum per day. Cuba produces about 30 or 40,000 barrels. So Cuba has enough petroleum to sell part of it, use it for its own needs, and sell part of it in the world market. So like they did with the Soviet Union, Venezuela is providing enough petroleum for Cuba to resell that petroleum in the world. If the situation were to improve in Venezuela, maybe the Maduro regime will increase petroleum deliveries to Cuba. I don't think so. I think that this is the top that the Maduro regime wants to do. They have their own major problems, so they're not going to do anything. There is an enigmatic figure behind the scenes, which is Alejandro Castro Espin, which is Raul's son. He's the only son he has. He's a very ruthless individual. He's a colonel in the military. He became sort of liaison between the military and the security apparatus during the period that Obama was negotiating with Cuba, and he was behind the scenes in all of these negotiations. He's younger. I don't know if the fact that he fought with Lopez Calleja is true or not, but it doesn't make any difference. He is only a colonel, and he's got a very limited base of support. The only thing he has is the name Castro Espin. Whether he can emerge at some point as the leader of the military and stage a coup and take over, it's only speculative. I don't give it a high priority. I give it a very low probability at this stage of the game. Let me end and let's see, we have some questions.
Thank you, Professor Suchlicki. Janet Cantor asks, if Raul dies, does that change anything? And I now open it up to questions and answers.
You want me to answer that?
Yes, please.
Well, basically, I don't think Raul's being alive or dead means much. He already left a legacy and a number of people in the Politburo of the party, which are key to a continuity of the revolution. He's also reorganized the military to the point that they are a significant force. The security apparatus is functioning well. So I don't think that with Raul's death, this is going to end. It may accelerate a small piece in the movement toward change, but it's not going to be a question, well, Raul dies tomorrow and this thing falls apart.
I believe that you may be running low on juice on the phone because you're, okay, you're back. I don't know if Professor Eire would like to comment.
Well, I think that Jaime is right. That there are individuals who've been placed in charge of these key functions of repression and governing. So it's set. The question remains, which of these three, or who else who is in the top level of the oligarchy can gain absolute control? But I used to say before Fidel got sick and retired early, that if Raul came to power, that was it, because Raul had no charisma. But look what happened. I think the same might happen with any of these characters, including Alejandro Castro Espin. I'm still baffled at the fact that Raul Castro was able to remain in power up until he stepped down from the throne. But then, of course, as Jaime was saying, things are set in place so that the machine can keep moving. And the issue of charisma doesn't factor in all that much, because nobody has the charisma Fidel used to have. So it's hard to compete on that level. Once the repressive machinery is in place, then there's a certain degree of stability.
If Trump had been reelected, would things have been better for the Cuban people? Question again from Janet Cantor. And for both of you.
Who had been elected?
If Trump had been reelected, would things have been better for the Cuban people?
Look, I think the depthness of the economic crisis in Cuba is so large that no matter what the United States does, this thing is not going to improve. It can improve in terms of sending money to the Cuban people, maybe more aid on the part of the corporations or people that want to send money. But let's point out something that I think is always left out of the discussion. The bulk of money that is sent to Cuba, or was being sent to Cuba, was being sent to the white population because they had white relatives and white friends in the United States. The black population of Cuba, which is the majority, the black and mulattoes, received almost zero. So if you look at Cuba and you go to Baracoa, Eastern Cuba, so you will find that there are many, many Black people living in the poverty of the 19th century. They're working the land, that they're cultivating a little thing, but they have nothing. And none of the modern technological elements that we need to provoke a change. So it is very sad, and that there is a racial division in Cuba, and the Cuban government has admitted that there is a racial problem. The question is, those things cannot be solved overnight. And no matter what you do by providing aid or money to Cuba, is going to resolve the social issues or the economic problems. The infrastructure of Cuba is breaking down. The water system is totally polluted. People are getting ill because of drinking the water when they can get water. Right now, there is a rebirth of the apagones, no light, so on, for a number of hours every day. So the situation is not improving, is deteriorating. So whether Trump had tightened the news around the Cuban government or had given more aid to the Cubans, it wasn't going to make a change.
Thank you. Any additional questions?
I mean, we answer all the questions.
Well, I have a few if others do not. I'll begin with a provocative question. Did Fidel Castro Diaz-Balart commit suicide?
Fidel Castro what? Committed suicide?
Diaz-Balart. Fidel Castro Diaz-Balart, Fidelito.
Fidelito. It's possible, I think. Of course, you know, one would never know, but he was supposedly under psychiatric care and he was depressed, so he jumps off the roof of the hospital. It looks a little sketchy. It's probable, but with no access to real information, we won't know. And maybe it was Alejandro who pushed him off. Not sure that would make any difference, but yeah.
I have a question. We are all assuming that Raul is out of the picture. Is that assumption absolutely correct?
Absolutely not. Raul is not out of the picture. Not only that, the three key people in the Politburo of the Communist Party, Lopez Calleja, Lopez Miera, and Alvarez Casas, they were picked by Raul. They are people that belong to Raul. Even Miguel Diaz-Canel, when he took over as Secretary General of the party, boasted that every major decision will be consulted with Raul. So we have to assume that Raul is very much in the picture, although not managing day-to-day the government.
Carlos, would you like to comment?
Yeah, well, I've always assumed he keeps his finger in the pie, and his finger will stay in the pie until he becomes either physically or mentally unable to function. There are rumors, again, but only rumors, that he was developing Alzheimer's and that he had some kind of cancer that Raul did. This information surfaced about the time of the transition, but I haven't seen anything else. No more rumors about this.
Any other questions?
Yeah, hello, everybody. I know we talk a lot about, you know, the first generation after from the Castro family, but I've also been seeing a lot of the second generation of the Castro family that has positioned itself at least to live the good life, or as I like to call it, the lifestyles of the rich and communist. But there's one character or one individual in particular, they call him a cangrejo. I believe his name is Guillermo Castro, Raul Castro's grandson. And if you look at any of the photographs of Raul Castro or any of the video of him, he is never more than a foot away from Raul. From what I've heard from others and from what I've read, is that he's the apple of his grandfather's eye. That's his favorite grandson. He keeps him close. And I'm curious, as from, you know, especially you, Dr. Suchlicki, that you've spoken to so many people, what have you heard anything, or have you seen anything that shows that they're basically preparing? This is sort of like the current setup that they have now is just to prepare it for this second generation of Castros to take it over, because I think we all know Raul and Fidel lasted much longer than anybody anticipated, and their children are kind of old and are getting to that point in time where they want to, you know, enjoy the millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that they've amassed. Have you heard anything on that front?
John, you want me to try to answer?
Yeah, I was just curious if you had heard anything on that.
Basically, he mentioned El Cangrejo, which is Raul's grandson, who is very irrelevant in the structure of power of the military. He is just the body. He was just the bodyguard of Raul, and I don't know where he's ending or where he's going to end. In terms of a second generation of the Castro family, the only one that could be an element was Alejandro Castro. But Alejandro is a very difficult guy, very arrogant. I don't know that he's well liked within the military circles. If he had a fight with Lopez Calleja, it's the wrong guy to fight with because he controls the money in Cuba. So I don't know that there is a new generation of Castros. The 5 sons of Fidel are not interested in politics, although all of a sudden they may develop an interest, but they are not. They're living well, they're traveling, they have yachts. So there's not that kind of family succession as we saw, for example, in North Korea, that there were 2 children of Kim Il-sung that were able to take power and control power. Cuba is not exactly like North Korea. I don't know, Cuba is probably more unique than any other countries in terms of a totalitarian control.
I have a question from Sergio Diaz-Balart. How do you factor in the rising discontent plus the increasing challenges of the police?
Look, discontent has been increasing gradually and sometimes very quickly over the past few years. There seems to be a more qualitative discontent and less organized, although we have a group of San Isidro and others, but it's more spontaneous. Yet the military has been able to control them, has repressed all of these oppositions. So whether this will develop into a solidarity organization like Poland or other organizations that have national character and interconnection, I don't know, and I am not sure that it's going to happen. Cuba is so subdivided in provinces, in municipalities, in towns, and the police has computerized databases of opposition leaders, people that are peligrosos to the system. So there is a very good repressive apparatus in Cuba. So I don't know whether this will lead to something or not.
Yeah, Jaime, you're absolutely right. I also think that the splintering that one sees in the opposition in Cuba is another factor to weigh in, because it's not the splintering is not for ideological differences. The splintering is just the fact that it's so difficult to communicate, so difficult to organize. And if there were the possibility of something like Polish solidarity being created, then the current discontent would mean more. But with, I don't know, I've lost count of how many different dissident organizations there are.
A question from Pablo Medina. As a corollary to Sergio's question, will the artists and writers of the San Isidro movement garner sufficient international attention to soften the repression? For both Professor Suchlicki and Professor Eire.
Basically, my answer is no. The international support and the international interest wanes and comes back at times. I don't think that the world is interested in what's happening in Cuba. So I think the San Isidro movement, I hope I'm wrong, will wane away, will become very small. Most of the leaders were beaten and arrested. So I don't see that as a very major challenge to the system.
Professor Eire, would you care to comment?
Yeah, well, I agree. I agree. It's, you know, it's so difficult from what I understand the few times I have been able to communicate with any of the dissidents via email, it has been a fleeting moment. It just doesn't last. It doesn't stick. It's so hard for them to maintain any kind of momentum, even as splintered as they are. So San Isidro, yes, everybody likes to say they pay attention to artists and so on and so on. But I think something to keep in mind is something like the documentary made by Nestor Almendros about the persecution of gays in Cuba. And I forget when that came out. Was it the 80s or 90s?
1984, I believe. Improper Conduct.
Improper conduct. Yes. Look what happened there. I think it got some awards, but it didn't change anything. Jaime is right. International interest in Cuban affairs, especially Cuban dissidents, is pretty thin.
Any other questions?
Nobody has mentioned the role of the church, which I had the impression was changing gradually in a positive direction. Does this have any impact on the current situation?
Some Catholic priests and even one bishop have been more outspoken recently. But again, there's no sign that this is gaining any traction whatsoever. I think it's a hopeful sign that you no longer have Cardinal Jaime Ortega cozying up to the regime, or anyone like him cozying up to the regime. But I think that these priests who have been very outspoken just cannot get sufficient traction. I know this. There's an organization here in the United States which is linked with the Vatican that collects funds to repair churches in Cuba. And actually the Knights of Columbus are involved in this too. The Castro regime has always been very happy to collect money to get things fixed because they can't fix them. But in what remains unclear to me is, does the regime take a slice of the pie, so to speak, when this money comes in for the rebuilding or repairing of churches? But then the evangelical churches, on the other, are the ones that are really bearing the brunt of repression and persecution, because they're more homegrown, right? They're more local than the Catholic Church, which always, all roads lead to Rome. So I think it's still the case. I could be wrong, but any child that attended religious instruction in Cuba, any kind of religious instruction, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, the children's names had to be reported to the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. And all children whose names were reported for having had religious instruction, their education would end at either age 14 or 16. Anyway, that was it for them. They were shut out of any kind of upward movement within their rotten, corrupt system. But there is that kind of persecution going on. And the Catholic Church is unable to put an end to this. Although it is a fact that the Cuban Catholic Church might be one of the very few in the entire Catholic Church that doesn't seem to have a problem with vocations. The seminary is full, right? And it's an alternative education. Some of those seminarians end up being sent to Rome and so on. So there is this sort of glimmer of hope that perhaps the Catholic Church might be able to do something to offer a pushback or resistance, but it's always going to be limited in some way.
Well, I have a question. What can a person of goodwill do to help Cubans seeking to be free? I get those emails occasionally from folks, and I'm curious to hear your responses.
First of all, sending money to Cuba is not the way. If you want to send money to the Black people that are the ones that are suffering mostly, sure, but they're not going to do that. And most of the people that are sending money or want to send money to Cuba are whites. So I don't think that that's going to help. Supporting an underground organization, if you live in Iowa, you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to have the contact. I don't know, maybe helping the Center for Free Cuba and my institute, the Cuban Studies Institute, will be a way to further information, knowledge, analysis about what's going on in Cuba, and therefore we can advise the government and other governments. I get visits from the Spaniards, the Japanese, the French. They all want to find out what's happening in Cuba, what's going to happen in Cuba. So there are things like that that you can do. But directly, one individual in the United States is very, very limited.
Carlos?
Yeah, it's quite obvious. There's not much any individual can do, or even an entire group, even the Knights of Columbus, for instance. The Knights of Columbus is largely responsible for rebuilding that seminary, San Carlos, with money collected from ordinary American Catholics through the Knights of Columbus. So now they have a new seminary. That's nice. That's good. They're repairing churches. That's good. But the way in which the regime always gets its pound of flesh when there's any transaction involved means that you're always in some way funneling money to the regime if you send money. I just got an email this week from someone who had traveled to Cuba with a group called something like Solidarity with the Cuban People. And I wrote back to him and I said, just from the title, it seems to me that this must be a regime-run kind of program, because they always substitute the term "the people" for themselves. The government is the people. But then he wrote back and said, "Oh, no, this group is above board, and it guarantees that none of the money involved in bringing these people to Cuba, none of it goes to the regime." And I almost wrote back saying, I'm sorry, but you've been fooled. But I didn't. I just ended the communication there. But they always do take their share, no matter what. And there's so much corruption. I had an uncle who passed away about 4 years ago. He worked for the Ministry of Culture. He worked for the Ministry of Culture. And his job was setting up art galleries to sell Cuban art to tourists. And he told me this is how it functioned. They'd tell me, go to this address, we're opening up a new gallery. And here are 10 gallons of paint to spruce up the place. The 10 gallons arrived. By the end of the day, he was left with 2 gallons because all these people came in saying, "Where's my gallon? Where's my gallon? Where's my gallon?" And it would be gone. And then at the end of the day, he said to himself, "Well, where's my gallon?" And the art gallery had to be painted with only one gallon can. And that goes on at all levels. So even if it's not, actual cash or money exchanging hands, there's some way that all of this dribbles into this corrupt system. So helping people directly is difficult I suppose I know one Canadian who goes there regularly. She married a Cuban, and she actually does help her husband's family by bringing them money. And somehow she managed, I don't know if Canadians can get away with it more easily than Americans can, but she actually does manage to bring money to her husband's family. But that doesn't help them become free. It just helps them be able to buy stuff.
Okay, I have a question from Ileana Fuentes. We will approach with the second period, or we can say that we're already in the second special period.
That's not mine.
That's not your, oh, excuse me, Aristides Falcon Paradi. We will approach the second special period, or it can already be said to be the second special period. Do you contemplate another Maleconazo happening as in 1994?
It could happen, but again, things are, from everything I read, the situation is intolerable right now in terms of what is available and what isn't available. And even the dollar stores are running out of goods. But I don't know if any kind of mass demonstration would make any difference. It is a special period, absolutely.
There is one, if you allow me, Carlos, there's one scenario that I've thought about it, and in some instances I've discussed it with elements of the US government, which is a march by Cubans toward Guantanamo. There's a road, people go to Guantanamo to work. There's no mines there, the mines have been removed. So assuming that all of a sudden you had 50,000, 100,000 Cubans marching on Guantanamo, what are the militaries going to do in Guantanamo? Are they going to shoot the Cubans? Are they going to let them in? If they let them in, are we going to let them in the United States? What is going to be the response of the US government? So that is a very sticky situation that can lead to a conflict between the Cuban government and the US government.
Okay, we're running out of time. I have one more question here from Ileana Fuentes. The face of San Isidro is black. The face of Patria y Vida is black. The face of many independent activists today is a young face and a black face. Will there not be different consequences internationally in light of the white face of the regime?
It's been going on for quite some time, the same phenomenon. Oscar Elias Bisset was in prison for how many years? Tamayo is also black. There's just a long list of previous Cuban dissidents who were black, and it didn't seem to, again, gain any special traction from overseas.
And I have a comment from Sally for everyone regarding what could our government do were it so inclined. There could be an aggressive outreach to potential leaders, both within and without the Cuban government. The message would be, with this regime, there is no hope of normalization. With the benefits that could bring you, including your survival within a successor regime, without the current leadership, anything is possible.
What I'm saying is that there would have to be a really aggressive action on the part of our diplomats and others who are unmentionable, a real effort, which I don't see any possibility of happening with this administration, and probably not even with a Trump administration. But were our government really serious? It's not a question of subversion. It's a question of being active and proactive with all the elements in Cuba. How many of the leaders do our diplomats know personally? How many do they really try to get to know? How much effort is being made? I have no idea. My suspicion is that our presence in Havana is rather bland and unimaginative and inactive. That's my impression.
Well, the question is there real interest on the part of the US government about what's happening in Cuba? Short of a involvement of Russian submarines in the Caribbean. And so the US government is not interested in Cuba. They want to keep it quiet. They don't want to have refugees. And that's the policy.
Carlos?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, yeah, it's a long history of the US not doing enough or actually doing the wrong things. But I have no clue whether anyone in the State Department or involved in national defense is paying any attention to the harbor that the Chinese are building near Santiago, near Guantanamo, which is supposedly for cargo container ships, right? But it's also perfect for Chinese warships. And I scour the news to see, I do the Google Cuba, China harbor in various languages, and I never come up with anything. It's like, is anybody paying attention to this? I think unless, China comes in and actually, starts docking warships in Cuba, nobody in the US is going to pay attention to these developments. Even though both Russia and China are very interested in getting a solid footprint in Cuba and Venezuela.
I have a question from William Southworth. Is this new harbor part of the Belt and Road Initiative, or is it an independent program?
I don't know, but it's been going on for at least minimum 2 years. I started reading about it about 2 years ago. And it's a total rebuild of the harbor, and it's being paid for entirely by the Chinese. So I don't know.
Well, I'd like to conclude with one final question, which hasn't been brought up today, and that is the Havana Syndrome, which has been in the news and began with initially somewhere in the number of 40 American diplomats being impacted in Cuba. Do you think that there are going to be any consequences for the Castro regime? If not actively participating in the injury, they probably knew who was doing it, how they were doing it, and were covering it up.
Well, I've seen a greater interest now in this subject than for the past few years. There was nothing, but right now, I think there is a greater interest. I don't know whether they're going to find out who was behind. I've got a feeling that the US government is looking at the Russians as the culprit for this kind of things and being done in Cuba by the Russians. We'll see. What are you going to do? Nuke Moscow? Attack Putin? Capture a plane where he's flying and bring it down in Belarus? I don't know.
Yeah, and I actually just in full humor mode, I'm waiting for some news story because they initially blamed the sounds that the diplomats heard on mating crickets. I'm waiting for one of the international news agencies to link these tic-tac UFOs with the sonic attacks. It's bound to happen because they'll find any excuse possible to sort of, pass on the guilt to someone other than Putin or the Castro regime.
Okay, well, our time is up. Thank you, Professor Carlos Eire. Thank you, Professor Jaime Suchlicki, for exchanging your views with us over the past hour. And thank you all for listening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, John. Thank you.
Bye.
All right.
Take care.
Everyone, take care.
Bye. Thank you too, John.
Thank you, Ambassador Reich.